Dear listeners, this channel publishes only full and exclusive audio stories. Please subscribe and like them if you enjoy them.
Chapter 1: The Reading of the Will. The rain had been falling on Blackthorn House for 3 days before the first guest arrived, and by the look of the sky, it had no intention of stopping to make anyone welcome. Marguerite Farrow saw the house before she saw the gates. It rose out of the mist at the top of the drive the way it always had, two mismatched wings pressed together like an old married couple who had long since stopped noticing each other's differences, its windows catching the last gray light of the afternoon and throwing it back, dull and silver, like the surface of a pond nobody had disturbed in years. She had not been back in 11 years. She had told herself, driving up from London with her wipers fighting a losing battle against the rain, that she would feel nothing. She had been wrong before she'd even parked the car. Still standing, then, she murmured to no one, and stepped out into the wet gravel. A man was waiting for her under the portico, sheltering beneath an umbrella that had clearly given up on one side. He was young, 22, perhaps 23. With the kind of quiet, watchful face that made you think he'd rather be anywhere else, and his hands had the calloused look of someone who worked outdoors for a living. "Miss Farrow?" he asked. "I'm Barty. Barty Quince. I do the grounds, mostly. Mrs. Pruitt asked me to bring the cases in, on account of the weather." "That's very kind of you." Meg studied him for a moment. There was something familiar in his face, though she couldn't place it, a trick of the light, perhaps, or the strange sentimentality of being back in a place that held so many old ghosts. "Have we met?" "Don't think so, miss. I've only worked here the last 6 years. He said it plainly, without curiosity, and reached for her case before she could stop him. "You'll want to get out of the rain. They're all gathering in the drawing room." "All?" "The others," he said, and something in his voice made it clear he did not entirely know what to make of the word either. Inside, the house smelled exactly as she remembered it, beeswax and old paper and the particular mustiness of rooms that were dusted often but never quite aired, and Meg found herself pausing in the hallway beneath the row of Blackthorn portraits, their painted eyes following her the way they always had, whether or not the artist had intended it. "They do that to everyone," said a voice behind her, dry as a good sherry. "The portraits. My theory is that whoever painted them anticipated 3 centuries of nervous solicitors and wanted them to feel judged." Meg turned to find a woman in her late 60s, silver hair pinned with the kind of careless precision that only comes from decades of practice, regarding her with open curiosity. "Winifred Sorrel," the woman said, extending a hand. "I don't suppose you remember me. You'd have been a child the last time I was here, and children never remember the boring adults, only the interesting furniture." "I remember the furniture very well," Meg said, and Winifred laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. "Good. That's something, at least. Come through, the others are already gathered, being awkward at one another over sherry they don't want." The drawing room was exactly as grand and exactly as cold as Meg remembered, its blue silk wallpaper faded to the color of an old bruise, a fire struggling gamely in the grate against a chimney that had never fully learned to draw when the wind came from the east. 4 people occupied the room with the particular stiffness of strangers forced into false intimacy, each holding a glass of sherry they were not drinking. A man near the window turned first. Tall, precise, dressed with the kind of care that suggested either genuine fastidiousness or a man trying very hard to look like he had nothing to hide. "Cashin O'Dell," he said, before anyone asked. "I understand we're all cousins of some description. Distant, in my case. I'd never heard of the place until 3 weeks ago." None of us had heard of much of anything until 3 weeks ago, from what I gather, said the man lounging. There was no other word for it. In the best chair by the fire, one leg crossed over the other with theatrical ease. He was handsome in the specific way of men who had learned early that their faces would forgive them a great deal. Peregrine Vantage. "Perry, please, unless you're planning to be formal with me, in which case I shall have to be formal back, and neither of us wants that." He raised his glass toward Meg without quite standing. "Family friend, allegedly. Owed a small debt, allegedly." "We're all doing a great deal of alleging this evening." By the fire, a woman with sharp, capable eyes and an air of quiet competence looked up from a folder of papers she'd been reviewing. "Adeline Rourke," she said. "I managed, the estate's accounts. I'm here in a professional capacity, to assist Mr. Radnor with the reading." She said it simply, without apology, though Meg noticed she did not meet anyone's eyes for longer than a moment. The last figure in the room rose from a chair near the window with the unhurried gentleness of a man used to comforting people in worse circumstances than this one. "Reverend Silas Pemberton," he said, taking Meg's hand in both of his. "I had the very great privilege of knowing Araminta for 30 years. I'm sorry we meet again under such circumstances, my dear. She thought a great deal of you, you know. Right to the end." Something in his voice, a weight, a held breath, made Meg look at him more closely, but before she could ask what he meant, the door opened and a small, precise man in an old-fashioned suit entered, carrying a leather case that had clearly been carrying important documents since before any of them were born. "Mr. Radnor," Winifred said. "Punctual as ever." "I should hope so," said Hollis Radnor, setting his case upon the table with the reverence of a man laying flowers on a grave. "Shall we begin?" "I understand everyone is now present who ought to be." "Not everyone," said Barty Quince quietly, from the doorway, where he'd remained with the cases still in his arms. "I was told to bring the young man's things up when he arrived, sir, but he hasn't come yet." "Ah," said Radnor, consulting a small list. Yes. He'll be along. The weather, no doubt." He looked around the room, and something in his expression, a flicker, quickly smoothed away. Suggested he found the whole gathering slightly distasteful, a duty rather than a pleasure. "In the meantime, perhaps you'd all care to be seated. What I have to say concerns every one of you, and I'd rather not say it twice." They arranged themselves around the room with the careful spacing of people who did not yet trust one another. Meg by the fire, Cashin by the window, Perry sprawled with studied carelessness, Adeline upright with her folder still in her lap, Winifred nearest the door, Reverend Pemberton with his hands folded as though already praying for whatever was about to happen. Barty remained standing, cases at his feet, clearly uncertain whether he was meant to stay or go, until Radnor gestured for him to sit as well. "You," Radnor said, without a hint of introduction, "have all been named in the last will and testament of Araminta Blackthorn, who died 6 weeks ago in this house, in her bed, of natural causes." He let the words sit for a moment. Outside, the rain intensified against the tall windows, a sound like static, like the house itself holding its breath. I won't waste your evening with the legal architecture. I will tell you what matters. He opened his case, withdrew a single bound document, and regarded it as though it were something that might bite him. Araminta Blackthorn has left her entire estate, this house, its grounds, its contents, and the whole of her considerable fortune, to be divided among the 7 of you gathered here tonight. A murmur went through the room, quickly suppressed. There is, however, Radnor continued, a condition. There's always a condition, Perry muttered, though his easy smile had thinned somewhat. The condition is this. Radnor's voice did not change, though several people in the room leaned forward without seeming to notice they had done so. None of you may claim any portion of the inheritance, not a single shilling, not a single object, until you have all lived together in Blackthorn House, continuously, for a period of 1 full year from tonight. Silence, this time, complete and total, broken only by the fire. Any beneficiary who leaves the estate before the year is complete forfeits their entire share, which will then be redistributed among those who remain. There are no exceptions for emergency, for illness, for family obligation, or for simple homesickness. You may leave at any time you wish. You will simply leave with nothing. That's absurd, said Cashin O'Dell, his composure cracking for the first time. A woman I've never met is holding my inheritance hostage from beyond the grave? I would put it more gently, said Radnor, but not, I think, inaccurately. Why? Meg asked quietly. It was the first time she had spoken since the reading began, and something in her voice, genuine grief, genuine confusion, made the room turn toward her. Why would she do this? She wasn't a cruel woman. Difficult, yes. Not cruel. Radnor was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its formal edge. I asked her the same question, when she instructed me to draft this clause. She said, he paused, consulting his memory rather than his papers. She said that a house like this one had spent 300 years collecting people who wanted things from it, and never once collecting people who simply wanted to live in it. She said if her money was going to matter to anyone, she wanted to know they'd earned the right to it by choosing to stay, not merely by being named. How very sentimental, said Adeline, and there was something in her tone, brisk, almost dismissive, that made Meg glance at her. There is one more matter, Radnor said, and here, for the first time, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable. The will name 7 beneficiaries. I have the list here, and I confess I did not draft it myself in its final form. Araminta made a late addition to her instructions, one I only received a matter of weeks before her death. He looked up, and his eyes settled, unmistakably, on the woman by the fire. Miss Rourke, you are named as the 7th beneficiary of this estate. Adeline went very still. That's not possible, she said, and for just a moment, something crossed her face that was gone before Meg could name it. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to alarm. I manage the accounts. I'm not family. I'm not, I never expected. Nevertheless, said Radnor, consulting the document, her instructions are quite clear. You are named, in her own words, as someone who has cared for this house as faithfully as anyone born to it. Perry laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound. Well, that rather changes the maths for the rest of us, doesn't it? It changes nothing, Adeline said, recovering her composure with visible effort. I intend to decline. You may decline, Radnor said mildly, once the year is complete, if you still wish to. Until then, I'm afraid, you are as bound by the condition as anyone else in this room. Dinner that evening was a strange, quiet affair, the great dining table, built for 20 and never once in Meg's memory filled, set now for 7 places that felt, somehow, both too many and not nearly enough. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, moved between them with the brisk efficiency of a woman determined not to let grief interrupt her routines, refilling glasses, and removing plates with a gentleness that suggested she had loved the house's late mistress more than she would ever say aloud. You knew her a long time, Mrs. Pruitt? Meg asked, when the housekeeper paused beside her chair. 31 years, miss. Something flickered across the older woman's face, grief, carefully contained. She was not an easy woman to know. But she was a good one, in her way. Difficult women often are, if you give them the chance. Was she ill, before the end? Reverend Pemberton mentioned. Her heart, Mrs. Pruitt said, a little too quickly. It had troubled her for years. The doctor wasn't surprised when it happened. She hesitated, and something passed behind her eyes that Meg couldn't quite read. Though I'll say this, miss, and I've said it to no one else. She seemed better, those last weeks. Sharper. Like a woman with something to do, rather than a woman waiting to die. It's strange, don't you think, for a heart to give out just when its owner had finally found a reason to keep using it. She moved on before Meg could ask what she meant, and across the table, Reverend Pemberton was watching the exchange with an expression of quiet, careful attention that made Meg's skin prickle, though she could not have said why. Conversation, when it came, was stilted and circling, Cashin speaking with clipped precision about a medical career he clearly did not wish to discuss further, Winifred offering dry, affectionate stories about the house's long history that somehow always stopped just short of anything useful, Perry charming everyone within reach and revealing nothing at all. Bartai ate quietly at the far end, clearly unused to being seated at this table rather than serving it, and said almost nothing, though Meg caught him once, staring at the portraits along the wall with an expression she could not name, not quite longing, not quite grief, something closer to recognition of a thing he could not yet identify. It was Reverend Pemberton who broke the strange, brittle mood, near the end of the meal, setting down his glass with a gentleness that drew every eye to him. I should say, he began, that Araminta asked something of me, in her final weeks. Something I have not yet had the chance to see through. I had hoped to speak of it privately, in time, but perhaps, given tonight's revelations, it no longer feels right to wait. Speak of what? Adeline asked, and Meg noticed. She could not have said why she noticed that the question came a fraction too quickly. The Reverend hesitated, his gaze moving slowly around the table, resting, for just a moment, on each face in turn. She told me, in her last confession, that she believed something in this house was not as it should be. That the numbers did not add up, in her words, and that she thought she understood why. She asked me to help her make things right, properly right, whatever the cost to those she loved. I told her I would help her however I could. The fire cracked in the silence that followed. And did she? Cashin asked quietly. Make things right? I don't know, the Reverend admitted. She died before she could tell me what she meant to do about it. I have thought of little else since." He looked, for a moment, deeply tired, deeply old, in a way he had not seemed before. "I only tell you this now because I think, whatever it was she suspected, it may concern more of us than we yet realize." No one spoke for a long moment. Outside, the rain had turned, somewhere in the last hour, into something closer to a storm, and the old house groaned softly against it, the way old houses do, settling into a night that felt, to everyone at that table, entirely unlike an ordinary one. It was nearly midnight when the house finally quieted, each of the 7 retreating to bedrooms that had not held guests in years, the corridors lit only by the low, uncertain glow of lamps Mrs. Pruitt had not yet learned to trust to modern wiring alone. Meg lay awake long after the house had gone silent, listening to the rain against her window, to the particular creak of old floorboards settling, to something, she told herself it was only the wind, that sounded, once, distantly, like a bell ringing somewhere deep inside the walls. She did not sleep well. None of them did. It was Mrs. Pruitt who discovered it, just past 6 the next morning, moving through the cold gray light of the corridors with the tea tray she brought each guest without fail, rain still streaking the tall windows behind her. Perry Vantage's door stood open. His bed had not been slept in. His window, the old sash window that looked out over the east lawn, stood open to the storm, curtains soaked through and clinging to the sill, rain pooling on the floorboards beneath. Of Perry Vantage himself, there was no sign at all. Chapter 2: The First Search. By 7 o'clock, the house was awake in a way it had not been the night before, not the polite, careful wakefulness of guests arranging themselves for breakfast, but something rawer, more urgent, footsteps hurrying along corridors that had, until a few hours ago, seemed content to sleep for another century. Meg was pulling on her coat before Mrs. Pruitt had even finished explaining what she'd found. "Show me," she said, and the housekeeper, pale and uncharacteristically flustered, led her at a near run through the east wing to the room where Perry Vantage had, or had not, spent the night. The window stood open exactly as Mrs. Pruitt had found it, rain-soaked curtains hanging limp against the sill, the bed beneath its counterpane untouched, still turned down from the night before with the particular emptiness of a room that had never been used. On the writing desk, a single sheet of hotel-quality stationery lay askew, as though someone had begun a letter and abandoned it halfway. Meg did not touch it. She had read enough detective novels in her life to know better, though she suspected, looking at the faces gathering in the doorway behind her, that instinct alone would not save this house from a great deal of handling before the day was through. "He can't simply have vanished," said Cashin O'Dell, arriving at her shoulder with the brisk authority of a man used to taking charge of frightened rooms. "People don't vanish. They leave, or they're taken, or something happens to them. There will be an explanation." "There had better be," said Winifred Sorrell, from the doorway, her dry composure noticeably absent this morning. "Because the alternative explanations are considerably worse than the man simply having got bored of US and climbed out a window. Bored enough to leave in a storm, without his coat, without a word?" Adeline Rourke's voice was measured, professional, though Meg thought she caught something tighter beneath it. "Forgive me, but that seems an unlikely sort of boredom." "He forfeits everything if he's simply left the grounds," Reverend Pemberton said quietly, from where he stood a little apart from the others, his hands folded in the manner Meg was already coming to recognize as his particular kind of prayer. Whatever else might be said of Peregrine Vantage, I do not think him a man who gives up money easily. It was Barty Quince, standing at the edge of the group with his cap still in his hands, who said what none of the others quite wanted to. The grounds go on for a fair way, past the wall. If a man wanted to hide rather than run, there's plenty of places on this estate a person mightn't be found for days. I'd know. I've near lost myself out there a time or two, and I've worked it 6 years. Hide, Cashin repeated. Why would an innocent man hide? No one answered him. It was, Meg thought, watching the room, exactly the wrong question to ask out loud in a house where nobody yet knew who was innocent of anything. Detective Inspector Wren Ashcombe arrived a little after 9, summoned by a telephone call from Mrs. Pruitt that had taken 3 attempts to get through the storm-damaged lines. She was younger than Meg had expected, perhaps 45, with the unhurried, deeply observant manner of someone who had long ago learned that the fastest way through a case was rarely the most direct one. She toured the grounds first, in the rain, refusing an umbrella, and returned an hour later with mud to her knees and no visible urgency at all, which several of the guests seemed to find more unsettling than if she had arrived shouting. No body, she said simply, gathering them in the drawing room, the fire once again struggling against the weather. No sign of a struggle at the window. The mud beneath it has been disturbed, consistent with someone climbing out rather than being thrown. I'd say, for now, that Mr. Vantage left this room under his own power, in some hurry, sometime in the small hours. Left to go where? Meg asked. That, said Ashcombe, is rather the question, isn't it? She looked around the room with the unhurried patience of a woman who had all the time in the world, whatever anyone else in it might feel. I understand there was a will reading last night. I understand it came with rather unusual terms. You've heard, then, said Winifred. Small villages talk, Miss Sorrel. Mostly to me, as it happens, since I'm generally the one they're talking about something to. Ashcombe's eyes moved slowly across each face. A year, all of you, together, or nothing at all. That's the sort of condition that makes people do rash things. I'd like, if you don't mind, to hear each of your accounts of last night. Individually, I think, would be best. She began with Cashin O'Dell, in the library, the two of them seated near the cold fireplace while rain streaked the tall windows behind them. Meg, waiting her turn in the hallway with the others, could hear nothing of what passed between them, only the low, steady rhythm of question and answer, like a slow and patient tide. When it was her turn, Ashcombe's questions were simpler than Meg had expected, and somehow more unsettling for their simplicity. You knew this house as a child, Ashcombe said. It was not a question. My mother was close friends with Araminta. I spent summers here, when I was young. And you liked her? Araminta. I loved her, Meg said, and was surprised by the sudden thickness in her own throat. She was sharp, and difficult, and utterly without patience for foolishness, and she was the only adult who ever took my drawing seriously when I was 11 years old. I loved her very much. Something in Ashcombe's face softened, briefly, before returning to its careful neutrality. Did you know she'd left you anything? No. I had no idea I was named at all, until last night. And Mr. Vantage? Did you know him, before yesterday? Not at all. None of us knew each other, as far as I understood it. Ashcombe nodded slowly, making a small note. One more question, Miss Farrow, and then I'll let you go. Last night, at dinner, Reverend Pemberton said something about Araminta believing that some part of this house's affairs was not as it should be. Do you have any idea what he meant? Meg hesitated. No. But Mrs. Pruitt said something to me this morning, before you arrived. I don't know if it means anything. Tell me anyway. I find it's usually the things that don't seem to mean anything that turn out to matter most. Meg found Mrs. Pruitt in the kitchen an hour later, the older woman's hands steady with tea things even as her face remained pale and drawn. The kitchen, at least, felt like the one honest room in the house, warm, close, smelling of bread and wood smoke, entirely unconcerned with the grandeur that governed the rest of Blackthorn. You said something to me this morning, Meg said gently, taking the seat Mrs. Pruitt gestured toward. Before all this began, with Perry. About Araminta. Mrs. Pruitt's hand stilled over the teapot. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Meg waited, having learned already, in her short time back in this house, that silence often produced more truth than questions did. She told me something, the week before she died, Mrs. Pruitt said finally, not looking up. I've turned it over in my mind every day since, wondering if I ought to have said something sooner, to someone. But I didn't know who to say it to, and I suppose I told myself it was only an old woman's fancy. What did she say? She said, if anything happens to me, it isn't an accident. Mrs. Pruitt's voice was very quiet, very careful, the words clearly ones she had rehearsed alone many times before finally speaking them aloud. I asked her what she meant, and she wouldn't say more, only that she'd been going over the accounts with Miss Rourke and something didn't sit right with her. She said she meant to get to the bottom of it, quietly, before she said anything to anyone that might not need saying. She looked up at last, and her eyes were wet. And then, not 10 days later, she was gone. In her sleep, they said. Her heart. The doctor didn't think twice about it, given her age, given her history. But you did. I think about it every night, miss. I found her myself, you understand. I've laid out the dead before, in my time. My own mother, my sister, God rest them both, and I know what a peaceful death looks like, and I know what one that isn't quite peaceful looks like too, though I couldn't have told you, at the time, which this one was. It's only since, turning it over and over, that it sits wrong with me. She looked, Mrs. Pruitt stopped, seeming to search for a word precise enough to hold what she meant. She looked surprised, miss. Just faintly. As though something had happened to her that she hadn't quite expected, even at the very end of a long illness she'd had years to expect it from. The kettle began, softly, to sing, and Mrs. Pruitt rose to see to it, visibly grateful for something ordinary to do with her hands. It was Winifred who found Meg later that afternoon, in the library, where Meg had retreated in search of quiet and found instead a room she could not stop looking at differently than she had the night before. You're staring at that wall as though it said something rude to you, Winifred observed, settling into the chair opposite with the ease of a woman entirely at home in libraries, wherever she found them. The paint, Meg said slowly. Look at it, there, along the shelving. It's not quite the same color as the rest of the wall. It's close. Close enough you'd never notice unless the light caught it just so. She had noticed it purely by accident, sunlight breaking briefly through the storm clouds and falling at an angle across the wall that revealed, for just a moment, a faint seam where old paint met newer. Winifred rose and crossed to look more closely, running a hand along the shelving with the proprietary familiarity of someone who had spent decades in this exact room. "You're right," she said slowly. "I hadn't noticed. Though I suppose I've not had cause to look at this wall properly in years." "Do you know why it might have been repainted?" "No idea. Houses this age are patched and repaired constantly, a damp patch, a crack in the plaster, nothing more sinister than that, most likely." But something in Winifred's voice lacked its usual conviction, and Meg found herself watching the older woman more closely. "You've been here a great many times, over the years," Meg said carefully. "I wonder if you might know something about a woman named Dorothy Quince." "Barty's mother, I believe." The change in Winifred was immediate and unmistakable, a stillness that had nothing to do with age, a tightening around the eyes that had everything to do with something being carefully, deliberately controlled. "I knew the name," Winifred said, after a pause just long enough to be noticeable. "She worked here, once, as a maid. Left the household some years before Araminta's husband died, if I recall correctly." "Did you know her well?" "Not especially." Winifred's voice had gone brisk, almost dismissive, in a way that told Meg more clearly than any confession could have that she was lying, or at the very least, that she was leaving out a great deal more than she was including. "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Meg said, though it was not entirely true, and something in the careful way Winifred studied her afterwards suggested the older woman knew it wasn't true either. They did not speak of Dorothy Quince again that day, though Meg noted, filing it away with the paint and the ledger and Mrs. Pruitt's careful, frightened words, that whatever Winifred Sorrel knew about that name, she had no intention of sharing it easily. Detective Ashcombe left just before dusk, promising to return the following morning, and cautioning all 7 remaining guests, 6, Meg corrected herself silently, only 6 now, until or unless Perry was found, against leaving the estate under any circumstances. "I understand you're all bound to stay regardless, given the terms of the will," Ashcombe said, at the door, rain still falling steadily behind her. "But I'd ask you to stay for my reasons now as well as Araminta Blackthorn's. A man is missing from a locked house in the middle of a storm, and until I understand why, I'd rather not have anyone else deciding to take an unscheduled walk out a window." The house settled slowly into evening, the rain unrelenting, the fires lit early against a chill that seemed to have crept into the walls themselves. Dinner was quieter than the night before, conversation thin and careful, everyone watching everyone else with the particular wariness of people who had begun to understand, without quite saying so aloud, that something in this house was not what it appeared to be. It was Reverend Pemberton who excused himself first, citing tiredness, though Meg thought, watching him go, that he looked less tired than troubled, his usual gentle composure noticeably strained. "I think I'll sit a while in the chapel before bed," he said, at the door. "I find I want quiet, tonight, more than sleep." No one thought anything of it. It was, after all, entirely in keeping with the man they had all come, in a day and a half, to think they understood. It was the last ordinary thing any of them would hear him say. Chapter 3, What the Walls Remember. Meg woke before dawn to the particular silence that follows a storm, not peace, exactly, but a held breath, as though the house itself were waiting to see what the rain had left behind. She lay for a long while listening to it, to the drip of water from the eaves, to the settling creak of old timber cooling after a night of wind, and found she could not shake the feeling that the library's repainted wall had been trying to tell her something she had not yet learned how to hear. She dressed quietly and went down before the others, candle in hand, though the electric lamps worked well enough now that the storm had passed. The library, in the gray early light, looked exactly as it always did, dark oak, high shelves, the particular hush of a room built for thinking rather than talking. But when she found the seam in the paint again, this time with proper light and proper patience, she saw what she had missed the day before. It was not merely a patch of repair. It was the outline of a door. "You found it, then?" Meg startled so badly she nearly dropped her candle. Barty Quint stood in the doorway, cap in hand as always, watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his particular blend of caution and curiosity. "Found what, exactly?" "The old passage door. There's a fair few of them, through the house. I only know because old Tam showed me, years back, when I was a boy hanging round the grounds waiting for work. Said the house was built with two faces. One for company, one for," he hesitated, searching for the word. "Everyone the company weren't meant to see. Servants, mostly. Deliveries. A quiet way through the house that didn't trouble anybody upstairs." "Can you open it?" Barty considered this for a long moment, as though weighing something more than a simple mechanical problem. Then he crossed the room, ran his hand along the third shelf from the corner, and pressed, in a spot that looked, to Meg's eye, entirely indistinguishable from any other section of oak paneling. Something clicked, faint but unmistakable, and a section of shelving swung inward with a groan of hinges that had clearly not been used in some time. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor, low-ceilinged, dust thick on every surface, disappearing into darkness in both directions. "Good Lord," Meg breathed. "There's more of these than you'd think," Barty said, holding his own candle up to reveal walls of bare, unpainted brick, the wood of the corridor floor worn smooth in a path down the center where feet had passed for 2 centuries. "Runs behind half the ground floor rooms, near as I can tell. Old Tam used to say a house like this was built by men who never quite trusted anybody, family included." Meg stepped through, carefully, candle held before her, and found the passage opened, after a short distance, into a small alcove where a set of ancient shelves held nothing but dust and a single, forgotten ledger, its leather binding cracked with age. "This wasn't repainted for a leak," she said slowly, turning the ledger over in her hands, careful not to disturb whatever might be inside it. "Someone wanted this door hidden. Recently, by the look of the paint." "Recently? How recently?" "Recently enough that the paint still smells faintly of turpentine, if you get close." She looked up at him. "Barty, does anyone else know these passages exist? Besides you and whoever built them?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the narrow corridor with an expression that was difficult to read in the candlelight. "Couldn't say for certain. Old Tam knew. Mrs. Pruitt might, though she's never said so to me. Miss Sorrel's been coming here longer than I've been alive. I'd wager she knows more about this house than any of us put together, if she cared to say." They emerged a few minutes later, dust on both their clothes, the ledger tucked carefully beneath Meg's arm, and found Adeline Rourke standing very still in the library doorway, watching the open panel with an expression Meg could not entirely place. "What is this?" Adeline asked, and there was something in her voice, too controlled, too careful, that made Meg's skin prickle faintly. "An old servant's passage," Meg said. "Barty's known about them for years. We only just found the door." "How extraordinary." Adeline's eyes moved over the dark corridor beyond, lingering a fraction too long before she seemed to catch herself and smile, thin and professional. "I'll admit, in 12 years of managing this estate's affairs, I never once heard mention of it. One would think Araminta might have said something, given how much time we spent together going over the accounts." "Perhaps she didn't know herself," Meg offered. "Perhaps not." Adeline's gaze flicked once more to the ledger beneath Meg's arm. "May I ask what you've found?" "An old book. I haven't looked properly yet." "Do let me know what it says, won't you? If it concerns the estate's history, I should very much like to have a copy for the records." She said it lightly, but Meg noticed, filing it away without quite knowing why it mattered, that Adeline did not leave the doorway until Meg had tucked the ledger fully out of sight. She found Reverend Pemberton an hour later, in the small garden behind the greenhouse, sheltering beneath the eaves from a fine mist that had replaced the storm's heavier rain. He looked, this morning, older than he had the night before. Not merely tired, Meg thought, but weighed down by something he was carrying alone and had not yet decided how to set down. "You look as though you've slept even less than I have, Reverend." "I confess I did not sleep at all," he said, with a small, rueful smile that did not reach his eyes. "I sat with the ledgers most of the night, Araminta's private accounts, the ones she kept separately from the estate's formal records, in a locked drawer of her writing desk. She gave me the key some weeks before she died, in case," she said, "anything should happen to her." Meg felt something cold settle in her chest. "What did you find?" "Nothing I fully understand," he admitted. "Numbers that don't quite match themselves, invoices for work I don't believe was ever done, payments to suppliers whose names I don't recognize, and cannot find any record of beyond the ledger itself." He looked at her directly, and something in his gentle face had hardened, just slightly, into something more resolute. "Miss Farrow, Meg, I believe Araminta uncovered something in this house's finances that troubled her a great deal in her final months. I believe she may have confided some part of it to me, without ever quite finishing the thought, because she did not live long enough to finish it herself. You should tell Detective Ashcombe." "I intend to. Tonight, or tomorrow at the latest." He hesitated, glancing back toward the house, its gray stone walls rising damp and silent behind them. "I only wanted, first, to be certain I understood what I was accusing someone of, before I said a word that might ruin an innocent person's reputation over an old woman's confused suspicions." He smiled, briefly, sadly. Araminta was sharp as a blade, Meg, right to the end. But she was also 84, and grieving a son she never stopped grieving, and I would not want to bring down accusation upon someone simply because a tired, sad old woman thought she saw something in a column of numbers that wasn't truly there. And if it was truly there? His expression, for a moment, was almost frightened. "Then I think," he said quietly, "that whoever put it there has a great deal more reason to be careful of me than I have reason to be careful of them." It was nearly noon when Meg, returning to the house through the side entrance nearest the study, found Cassian O'Dell standing at Araminta's old writing desk, its drawers pulled half open, papers disturbed across its surface in a way that suggested a search rather than idle curiosity. "Dr. O'Dell." Her voice was sharper than she intended. He turned, and for just a moment, something guilty flickered across his composed features before he mastered it. "Miss Farrow. I didn't hear you." "What are you doing?" "Looking for something, if I'm honest, though I confess I'm not entirely certain what." He gestured at the desk with visible frustration. "I've been thinking about what Reverend Pemberton said, at dinner, the first night. About the accounts not adding up. I trained as a physician, not an accountant, but I do understand the shape of a lie, Miss Farrow, whatever field it's dressed in. And I thought, perhaps, if there was something here that might tell me whether Araminta's death was truly as natural as everyone insists." "You think she was murdered?" He did not flinch from the word. "I think it is at least worth ruling out properly, which no one appears to have done." "There was no autopsy, Miss Farrow." "A woman with a known heart condition dies quietly in her sleep, and everyone nods and says of course, poor thing, her heart, and no one thinks to ask whether something might have been done to hurry that heart along." His voice had gained an intensity that surprised her. "I was suspended from my hospital for asking uncomfortable questions about a death that everyone wanted explained away quickly. I find I have not lost the habit, whatever it's cost me." Meg studied him for a long moment, uncertain whether what she felt was suspicion or something closer to recognition. "Have you found anything?" "Nothing yet. Only that her heart medication is here, in this drawer, and the bottle is nearly full, though her prescription would have run for months at the dosage listed." He held it up, an ordinary brown bottle, half in shadow. "I don't yet know what that means. But I intend to find out." Dinner that evening was strained in a new and different way, not merely the wariness of strangers, but the particular tension of people who had each, separately, begun turning over private suspicions they were not yet ready to share aloud. Reverend Pemberton was quiet throughout the meal, his usual gentle warmth replaced by a distracted, inward attention that Meg found herself watching with growing unease. "You've barely touched your supper, Reverend," Winifred observed, not unkindly. "Forgive me. I find I have a great deal on my mind this evening." He glanced, briefly, toward Meg, something unspoken passing between them, an acknowledgement of a conversation neither of them had shared with the table. "I think, if you'll excuse me, I'll sit a while in the chapel before I retire. I find the quiet there helps me think." "2 nights running," Adeline observed lightly. "You'll wear a path in the flagstones, Reverend." "Old habits," he said, with a small, tired smile, and rose from the table with the careful, deliberate movement of a man carrying something heavy that no one else could see. "Good night, all of you. I hope tomorrow brings better news of Mr. Vantage." They did not know, watching him go, that it would be the last time any of them saw him alive. It was Barty who found him, just past 6 the next morning, arriving early to see to the greenhouse fires and passing the chapel on his usual route through the grounds. The door stood ajar, which struck him as unusual enough to make him pause, and when he pushed it open, the sight within stopped him entirely. Reverend Silas Pemberton lay slumped in the front pew, his hands still folded as though in prayer, a small silver chalice overturned beside him, a dark stain of spilled communion wine soaking slowly into the old wood of the pew. His face, in the gray morning light through the chapel's narrow windows, wore an expression of mild, faint surprise, the same look, Meg would think later, with a chill she could not entirely explain, that Mrs. Pruitt had described finding on Araminta Blackthorn's face 6 weeks before. Barty's cry brought the rest of the house running, and Meg arrived at the chapel door in time to see Mrs. Pruitt sink to her knees beside the pew, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other reaching, trembling, to touch the Reverend's still shoulder. "He was writing something," Cashin said quietly, from where he knelt beside the small chapel table, examining a half-finished letter that lay beneath the Reverend's overturned pen, the ink still faintly wet where the last words trailed off unfinished. "Look, to someone who deserves to know the truth," and then nothing. He never finished it. Adeline stood very still in the chapel doorway, her face pale, her composure, for once, entirely absent. "2 deaths," she said quietly, to no one in particular, in the same house, in the same fortnight. Surely even the most devoted believer in coincidence would find that difficult to accept. Meg looked at the overturned chalice, at the dark stain spreading slowly across old wood, and felt, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely and completely afraid. Chapter 4: A Death in the Chapel. Detective Inspector Wren Ashcombe arrived within the hour, her unhurried manner from 2 days before entirely gone, replaced by a brisk, focused energy that made the remaining guests feel, for the first time, that they were not merely inconvenienced witnesses but people who might genuinely be in danger. She examined the chapel for nearly 40 minutes before allowing anyone else inside, and when she emerged, her face gave away nothing at all. "The local surgeon will make a formal examination," she said, gathering the 6 remaining guests in the drawing room, the fire once again lit though it did little to warm the particular chill that had settled over the house. "But I'll tell you now what I expect he'll find, because I'd rather you heard it from me than from village gossip by supper time. Reverend Pemberton's heart appears to have failed him. There are no marks of violence upon him. Nothing to suggest a struggle." "His heart," Cashin repeated, very quietly, from his place near the window. "Is there some difficulty with that assessment, Dr. Odell?" He hesitated, and Meg, watching him, understood that he was weighing something carefully, how much to say, and to whom, and when. "I'd want to see the wine," he said finally. "The chalice. Before anyone cleans it away or disposes of it." Ashcombe studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because 2 people have now died in this house within 6 weeks of one another, both of apparently natural causes, both with hearts that simply stopped when it was convenient for them to stop, and I find myself, as a physician, rather less willing than everyone else in this room to call that an unremarkable coincidence." His voice had gained an edge of the same intensity Meg had seen the day before, in the study. "I'd like the wine tested, Inspector." "Properly. Not assumed away because an old vicar's heart seemed a reasonable enough thing to fail on its own." For a long moment, Ashcombe said nothing at all, her eyes moving slowly across his face with an expression Meg couldn't quite read, not dismissal, exactly. Something closer to careful reconsideration. "I'll have it tested," she said finally. "In the meantime, I'll want to speak with each of you again. Individually. And I'd ask, this time, that you think very carefully about where you were last night, and who might confirm it, because I no longer believe I'm dealing with an unfortunate series of natural deaths in an old house." She began, this time, with Mrs. Pruitt, whose account was simple and unwavering. She had gone to bed shortly after clearing the dinner things, had heard nothing unusual in the night, and had risen at her usual hour to find Barty already at the chapel door, his face white as chalk. Barty's account was equally simple. He had gone straight from his cottage on the grounds to the greenhouse, as he did every morning, and had passed the chapel only because the door, unusually, stood open. "You didn't hear anything in the night? See anyone about?" "No, ma'am. My cottage is a fair walk from the main house. I wouldn't hear much of anything, this far out, over the rain we've had." Ashcombe made a note, unhurried, and turned her attention next to Winifred Sorrel, whose composure, Meg noted from the hallway where she waited her own turn, seemed noticeably more brittle than it had been 2 days before. "You were close with Araminta's late brother, I understand," Ashcombe said. Once the two of them were settled in the library, the door left slightly ajar, whether by accident or design Meg could not say. "Engaged to him, at one point. A very long time ago, Inspector. He died before we ever married." "I don't see what that has to do with the vicar's heart failing him at his prayers." "Perhaps nothing at all. I find, in my line of work, that it's rarely useful to decide in advance what has to do with what." A pause. "You've been to this house a great many times over the years, I understand. Would you say you know it well?" "As well as anyone still living, I imagine." "Do you know of any hidden passages? Rooms not commonly used?" There was a pause, brief, but noticeable even through the half-open door, before Winifred answered. "There are servants' corridors, yes, from the old days. I couldn't tell you precisely where they run. It's not the sort of thing one commits to memory, unless one has cause to." "And did you have cause to, Miss Sorrel?" "No," Winifred said, a fraction too quickly, and Meg, listening from the hallway, felt a small, uncomfortable certainty settle over her. Not that Winifred had killed anyone, exactly, but that Winifred was, without question, lying about something, and had been lying about it since the moment Meg had first mentioned Dorothy Quince's name. Adeline's interview, when it came, struck Meg as strange in a way she could not immediately articulate, not because Adeline said anything obviously suspicious, but because everything she said was so precisely, carefully correct that it left almost nothing for anyone to hold on to. "You manage the chapel's supplies, I understand," Ashcombe said. "The communion wine among them." "I oversee the household accounts generally, which includes ordering supplies for the chapel, yes, since Araminta preferred to keep those costs separate from the main kitchen budget. She was particular about it." Adeline's voice was even, professional, entirely without hesitation. "I placed the last order myself, some 3 weeks ago. I can provide you the invoice, if it would help." "Who has access to the chapel's supplies, once they're delivered?" "In principle, anyone in the household. In practice, I imagine very few people have cause to go into the chapel at all, outside of Reverend Pemberton himself, and myself, when I check the accounts against the deliveries." She paused, and something in her expression shifted, very slightly, into what might have been genuine grief or might have been something more carefully performed. "He was a kind man, Inspector. I've known him the better part of 12 years, since I first came to manage the estate's affairs. I can't imagine why anyone would wish him harm." "Nor can I, yet," said Ashcombe. "Which is rather why I'm asking so many questions." Meg's own interview was brief. Ashcombe seemed satisfied, by now, that Meg had little to add beyond what she'd already offered 2 days before. And it was as she left the library that she found Cashin waiting in the corridor, his expression tight with something that looked, to her eye, very much like barely contained frustration. "She won't say what she thinks," he said quietly, once they'd moved out of easy earshot of the library door. "Ashcombe. I can see it in her face, the way she's turning it over, but she won't commit to anything aloud, and I understand why. A detective who speaks too soon is a detective who's wrong twice. But I find I've very little patience left for careful ambiguity, Miss Farrow, given that 2 people in this house are now dead. You still think Araminta was murdered?" "I'm more certain of it every day." He glanced back toward the library door, lowering his voice further. "I asked Mrs. Pruitt more about the medication bottle this morning. She confirmed what I suspected. The bottle in Araminta's drawer is nearly full, despite a prescription that should have run it down considerably by the time of her death. Either Araminta stopped taking her medication in her final weeks, which seems unlikely for a woman as careful about her health as everyone describes her, or someone was diluting or replacing her dosage without her knowledge. To what end? Digitalis, the medication itself, in the wrong quantity, at the wrong concentration, can be fatal. Too little, over time, and her underlying condition might have worsened rapidly, in a way that would look, to any doctor not looking closely, exactly like a natural decline. His eyes were sharp, urgent. "I don't yet know if that's what happened. I only know that a full bottle where there should be an empty one is not nothing, and no one else in this house seems the least bit interested in asking why." It was later that afternoon, in the quiet aftermath of the local surgeon's brief, unrevealing examination of the Reverend's body, that Meg found herself standing once again in the library, staring at the section of shelving that concealed the hidden passage, turning over everything she had learned in the past 3 days. A sound from deep within the walls made her go very still. Not the wind, not the settling of old timber, but something closer to a bell, faint and distant, ringing somewhere in the house's hidden arteries. Mrs. Pruitt, passing through with a tea tray, noticed her stillness and paused. "You've heard it too, then," the housekeeper said, not unkindly. "The bells." "What is it?" "Old wiring, miss, nothing more. The house was used as a convalescent home during the war. Officers recovering from their injuries, and a call system rigged up through the walls so the nursing staff could be summoned from any room without shouting through the corridors. It was never properly removed when the house went back to being a house. Comes alive now and then, when the damp gets into the old wires, or when a door's opened somewhere that disturbs the connections. Gave me a proper fright the first winter I worked here, before old Mr. Vane explained it to me. It sounds like it's coming from inside the walls themselves." "That's because it is, miss. The wiring runs through the same channels as the old servants' passages, near as I understand it, left over from when this house couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a hospital or a home." Mrs. Pruitt's smile was thin, tired. "Nothing supernatural about it, whatever the old stories say. Just an old house that's never quite finished remembering all the things it used to be." It was, Meg thought, a strangely apt description of everything about Blackthorn House, a place that had never quite let go of any version of itself it had ever worn, each one layered over the last, waiting patiently to be uncovered by anyone willing to look closely enough. Dinner that evening was subdued in a manner that had gone beyond mere weariness into something closer to grief. Reverend Pemberton's absence at the table a physical weight none of them could quite ignore, his chair pointedly left unset by Mrs. Pruitt, as though even she could not bring herself to pretend the evening was ordinary. 2 of us gone in less than a week, Winifred said quietly, halfway through a meal none of them had much appetite for. I confess I find myself wondering who thought this house was a fitting place to bind 7 strangers together for a year. Someone who trusted this house more than she trusted any of us to make good choices on our own, Adeline said, and there was something brittle in her voice that made Meg glance at her, though she could not have said precisely why. It was Cashin who caught Meg's eye across the table, a small, deliberate gesture that told her, without a word, that he wished to speak with her privately once the meal had ended. She found him afterward in the corridor outside the drawing room, the house quiet around them, rain beginning again softly against the windows. "I've been thinking all day about what I told Ashcombe," he said, his voice low. "About the medication. About the pattern of it, 2 deaths, both apparently natural, both convenient for someone, both entirely unremarkable to anyone not looking closely enough to notice the shape of the lie underneath them. And I don't think Araminta died of a weak heart either, Meg." His eyes, in the low corridor light, were sharp and entirely certain. "I think someone in this house killed her, quietly, carefully, in a way designed to look exactly like an old woman's body finally giving out after a long illness. And I think whoever did it grew frightened when Reverend Pemberton began asking the wrong questions about the accounts, and killed him too, in a way designed to look exactly the same." The rain against the windows seemed suddenly very loud in the silence that followed. "Which means," Cashin continued, quietly, deliberately, "that whoever it is still in this house tonight. Sitting at that table with us, not an hour ago, eating soup and discussing the weather as though nothing at all were wrong." Chapter 5, The Invoice. Hollis Radnor returned to Blackthorn House 3 days after the Reverend's death, summoned by a telephone call from Detective Ashcombe that had, by his own admission, left him deeply unsettled in a way 30 years of quiet solicitor's work had never quite prepared him for. 2 deaths, he said, settling into the library with the particular stiffness of a man forcing himself to remain composed. In the same house, within 6 weeks of one another. "I confess, Inspector, I find myself entirely out of my depth. My work has always been wills, and trusts, and the occasional dispute over a hedgerow. I am not equipped for this." "You may be more equipped than you think," Ashcombe said, sliding a folder across the desk toward him. "I'd like your professional opinion on something." Miss Farrow found this ledger in a passage behind the library wall. "I understand you managed Araminta Blackthorn's legal affairs for a great many years. Does anything in these pages strike you as unusual?" Radnor opened the ledger with visible reluctance, and Meg, seated nearby at Ashcombe's invitation, watched his expression shift slowly from professional detachment to something closer to genuine alarm as he turned the pages. "This is not one of the estate's formal account books," he said finally. "I don't recognize this ledger at all, and I have reviewed Blackthorn House's finances every year for the better part of 2 decades. He turned another page, frowning. "These entries, payments to a supplier called Farrow and Holt, for repairs to the east wing roofing, dated some 4 years ago. I have no memory of authorizing any such repair, and I would certainly remember one, given the cost recorded here." "Is it possible you simply forgot?" Ashcombe asked, though her tone suggested she did not think it likely. "I keep meticulous records, Inspector. It is, forgive me, rather the entire foundation of my profession." Radnor's frown deepened as he examined the page more closely. "And look here, the signature authorizing this payment. It is meant to be mine. It is a passable forgery, I'll grant whoever produced it that much, but it is not my hand. I have signed my own name enough times in 61 years to know it when I see it, and to know it when I don't. Meg felt something cold settle in her chest. Someone forged your signature to authorize payments for work that was never done. So it would appear. Radnor's voice had gone very quiet. And if this ledger contains one such entry, Inspector, I should very much like to know how many more it contains. It took the better part of the afternoon for Radnor, Ashcombe, and Meg to work through the ledger's pages together, and what emerged, entry by entry, was a pattern too consistent to be accidental: payments to suppliers whose addresses, when checked against county records, did not exist. Invoices for repairs to sections of the house that showed no evidence of any recent work at all, a steady, careful drain of funds stretching back, as far as they could determine, at least 8 years. Someone has been stealing from this estate for the better part of a decade, Ashcombe said finally, closing the ledger with the particular care of someone handling evidence rather than mere paper. Quietly. Carefully. In amounts small enough, individually, never to draw attention, but adding up, over time, to a very great deal of money indeed. Who had access to authorize payments in this manner? Meg asked. Radnor's expression was troubled. In principle, only myself, as the estate's solicitor, or Araminta herself. In practice, he hesitated, clearly reluctant to say what came next. In practice, Miss Rourke handled the day-to-day management of the accounts for many years, including, I believe, a great deal of correspondence with suppliers that I would have simply reviewed and signed off on, trusting her figures, as one does with a clerk one has come to rely upon. You're suggesting Miss Rourke forged your signature? I'm suggesting nothing, Inspector. I'm telling you what access existed, and to whom. What anyone did with that access is rather your department, not mine. But something in his careful, lawyerly phrasing did not entirely disguise his unease, and Meg understood that Hollis Radnor, whatever his professional caution, had already begun to suspect the same thing the rest of them had not yet dared say aloud. It was Bartai who found Meg in the greenhouse that evening, tending the last of Araminta's orchids with the quiet, careful attention of a man who had clearly been doing so, unasked, since long before anyone had thought to notice. You've kept these alive, Meg said, watching him work. All this time, since she died. Seemed wrong not to. She loved this place more than any other room in the house, near as I could tell. He did not look up from his work, his hands moving with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his usual quiet reserve. Old Tam used to say a garden tells you more about a person than their own family will, if you're patient enough to listen to it. Bartai, may I ask you something, and you won't take it the wrong way? He looked up then, his expression carefully neutral. You can ask. Detective Ashcombe mentioned, this afternoon, that whoever forged Mr. Radnor's signature would have needed access to the estate's paperwork, and knowledge of how the accounts were managed. You've worked here 6 years. You know this house and its routines better than almost anyone. Something flickered across his face, not quite hurt, not quite anger, something closer to weary resignation, as though he had expected this question sooner rather than later. I do the grounds, Miss Farrow. I've never once set foot in the estate office, nor had cause to. Old Tam taught me plants and soil and how to keep a greenhouse warm through an English winter. He never taught me a thing about ledgers, and I never asked him to. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to suggest. You did mean to suggest it, he said, not unkindly, same as everyone else in that house has been looking at me sideways since the day I brought your cases in from the rain. I don't fault you for it. I'm the one nobody quite knows what to make of. Groundskeeper's boy at a table meant for gentlefolk, left a bequest nobody can explain. Easier to wonder about the one who doesn't fit than the ones who do. He returned to his work, his hand steady despite the tightness in his voice. I'll tell you what I told the inspector, for what it's worth. I never wanted anything from this house beyond a wage and a warm bed in winter. Whatever's been taken from it, it wasn't taken by me. Meg believed him. Had believed him, if she was honest, before he'd even finished speaking, but she understood, watching his careful, guarded face in the greenhouse's fading light, that belief alone would not be enough to clear him in a house where everyone had reason to suspect everyone else. It was nearly dusk when Adeline found the three of them still gathered in the library, Radnor's papers spread across the desk. The fire burned low against a chill that seemed to have settled permanently into the old stone walls. I understand you've found some irregularities in the accounts, she said, and Meg noted, with the particular attentiveness she had begun cultivating over the past several days, that Adeline's voice was steady, professional, entirely without the defensiveness one might expect from someone under suspicion. Some considerable irregularities, Ashcombe said. Stretching back at least 8 years. I understand you managed the day-to-day accounts for much of that period. I did, and I'll tell you plainly, Inspector, that I've spent this entire afternoon going over my own records trying to understand how something like this could have happened without my noticing. Adeline's expression was tight, controlled, but Meg thought she detected, beneath it, something that might have been genuine distress. I trusted the suppliers I dealt with. I trusted the invoices that came to me. If someone has been forging documents and diverting funds, I can assure you it was done without my knowledge, and I find the suggestion that it might have been done with my knowledge, however implicit that suggestion may be, deeply insulting, given 12 years of loyal service to this family. No one has accused you of anything, Miss Rourke, Ashcombe said mildly. No one has needed to, Inspector. I can read a room well enough to understand where suspicion is settling. She drew herself up, composed once more. I would ask, if it's not too much trouble, that you conduct your investigation properly, rather than simply concluding that the woman who happened to manage the money must therefore be the woman who stole it. I have given this estate 12 years of my life. I would rather not have that service rewarded with an accusation built on nothing more than proximity. It was, Meg thought, watching her go, a perfectly reasonable thing to say, delivered with perfectly reasonable indignation, and yet something in the careful precision of it left her unable to entirely set aside the unease that had been building in her since the moment, days before, when Adeline had lingered a fraction too long in the library doorway, watching the hidden passage with an expression Meg still could not quite name. It was Radnor, an hour later, sorting through a final stack of papers by lamplight, who made the discovery that would carry them all forward into a very different night than any of them had expected. Here, he said, holding up a single loose page that had clearly been torn, hastily, from a larger ledger. This wasn't in the passage with the rest. Mrs. Pruitt found it this afternoon, tucked into a coat pocket in the room where Mr. Vantage was last seen. She only just thought to mention it. Ashcombe took the page, studying it beneath the lamp. A payment record. To a Mr. Josiah Crane, described here as a private lender. She looked up. Does that name mean anything to either of you? Meg shook her head, but something in Radnor's expression had gone very still. It does to me, he said slowly. Josiah Crane is a moneylender operating out of London, known to the courts for rather less than scrupulous practices. I've encountered his name before, in an entirely different matter, some years ago. He looked up, his expression troubled. If Mr. Vantage owed money to a man like Crane, and if Crane's name appears connected, however loosely, to funds moving through this estate, then whatever debt Mr. Vantage was running from, Ashcombe finished quietly, may be considerably more tangled up in this house's affairs than any of us have yet understood. The three of them sat with that thought in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling low in the grate, rain beginning once more against the tall windows. It was Meg who heard it first, a sound from beyond the library's far wall, low and indistinct, unmistakably human, coming from somewhere deep within the hidden passage none of them had thought to check since the day she and Barty had first discovered it. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Ashcombe was already on her feet, moving toward the shelving with quiet, deliberate speed. She pressed the hidden catch, and the panel swung open onto darkness and dust and the unmistakable, distant sound of someone breathing, hard and frightened, somewhere further along the passage than any of them could see. "Whoever's in there," Ashcombe called, her voice carrying with practiced authority into the dark, "I'd ask you to come out now, slowly, with your hands where I can see them." For a long moment, nothing answered but silence. Then, from somewhere deep within the walls of Blackthorn House, a voice they all recognized, hoarse, frightened, entirely unlike its usual careless charm, spoke out of the darkness. "Please," said Peregrine Vantage, "don't let her know I'm here." Chapter 6, The Man in the Walls. For a long moment, nobody in the library moved. The voice from the darkness had been unmistakable, and yet entirely unlike itself, stripped of all its careless charm, hoarse with thirst and fear in equal measure. "Mr. Vantage," Ashcombe said, her tone carefully even, "I would very much like you to come out of that passage now." "Is she with you?" The voice was closer now, footsteps shuffling slowly through dust and darkness. "Miss Rourke." "Is she in the room?" "She is not," Ashcombe said. "There is myself, Miss Farrow, and Mr. Radnor, and no one else." "You have my word." A long pause, and then Perry Vantage emerged from the passage into the lamplight, and Meg had to stifle a gasp at the sight of him, his clothes filthy and torn, his face gaunt beneath several days' growth of beard, his eyes darting toward the door with the particular wariness of a man who had not slept properly in far too long. "Water," he managed, his voice cracking. "Please, if there's any to be had." Mrs. Pruitt, summoned by the commotion, arrived within minutes with water, bread, and an expression of such profound relief that Meg understood, watching her, just how much the housekeeper had feared finding a second body rather than a living man. It was some time before Perry was in any state to speak coherently, seated near the fire with a blanket around his shoulders, hands still shaking slightly around his cup. Ashcombe waited, with the particular patience of someone who understood that a frightened man rushed too quickly rarely told the whole truth. "Take your time, Mr. Vantage," she said finally. "But I will need to understand why a man vanished from a locked room in the middle of a storm, and spent 5 days hiding in the walls of a house rather than simply asking for help." Perry's hands tightened around his cup. "I owe money," he said finally, his voice low. "A great deal of it. To a man in London named Josiah Crane, who does not extend patience to those who owe him past the terms he sets, and who has men working for him who make that lack of patience very clear in ways I'd rather not describe in present company. We found a ledger entry connecting Crane's name to this estate," Ashcombe said. "A payment record. It was in your coat pocket." Perry closed his eyes briefly. "I found it the first night, after the will reading. I couldn't sleep. Too much sherry, too much strange news, and I went looking through the desk in my room for something to read, the way you do when you can't settle. There was a folder there, left by mistake I assumed, papers concerning the estate's finances. I only meant to glance at it out of idle curiosity." His hands tightened further. And there, in the middle of it, was Crane's name. A payment, made from an account connected to this house, to the very man I owed money to. "You thought you'd been set up," Meg said quietly, beginning to understand. "I thought, God forgive me, I still half think it, that whatever debt I owed Crane, someone in this house was tangled up in paying it off, or laundering money through him, or some arrangement I couldn't begin to untangle at 2 in the morning with sherry still in my blood. And I panicked. I thought, if I've stumbled onto something I'm not meant to see, and there are 2 people in this house connected to a man like Crane, then whichever of them arranged that payment is not someone I want finding me alone in a locked room at night." He looked up, and something in his exhausted eyes was entirely sincere. "So I climbed out the window and hid, like a coward, because I did not know who to trust, and I still don't, entirely, though I trust you rather more than I did 5 days ago, Inspector, given that you're the one who found me rather than dragged me out to finish whatever I imagined someone meant to start." "Who did you think it was?" Ashcombe asked. "You called out, before you emerged. You asked if a specific person was in the room." Perry's expression tightened. "Miss Rourke," he admitted. "I don't know why, exactly, beyond the fact that she manages the money, and the folder I found was on her handwriting, near as I could tell, and a frightened man in the dark begins seeing patterns in everything, whether or not they're truly there. I could be wrong. I likely am wrong. But 5 days alone in the walls of this house does something to a man's judgment, Inspector, and I'd rather tell you my suspicion honestly than pretend I didn't have one." Ashcombe made a slow, careful note, her expression giving nothing away. "You'll understand, Mr. Vantage, that your own account places you very close to a great deal of financial impropriety in this house, at exactly the time 2 people connected to that impropriety happened to die." "I understand it perfectly," Perry said, with a flash of his old, tired humor. "I've had 5 days in the dark to understand it, Inspector, and precious little else to do besides." It was Cashin who examined Perry properly an hour later, confirming what anyone could see plainly enough: dehydration, exhaustion, minor cuts and bruises from days spent navigating dark, unfamiliar passages, but nothing that rest and proper food would not mend given time. "You're fortunate," Cashin said, checking his pulse with brisk professional care. 5 days without proper water is not a small thing, whatever else you were running from." "I found a cistern," Perry admitted. "Old rainwater collection, from the war years, still connected somehow to a pipe in the walls. Foul stuff, but it kept me alive. I'd not recommend it as a diet, however." Meg, watching from the doorway, found herself troubled by something that had nothing to do with Perry's physical condition. "You said you found the folder the first night," she said slowly. "Before anyone else knew Miss Rourke was even named in the will." "How did you know to be suspicious of her specifically, if you'd never met her before that same evening?" Perry's exhausted eyes met hers, and something in his expression suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask precisely that question. "Because of the handwriting," he said again. "I've a good eye for hands, Miss Farrow. Comes of a misspent youth forging signatures on documents I'd rather my father hadn't seen. The ledger entries in that folder, the ones connecting to Crane, were written in a hand that matched, near as I could tell in poor lamplight and worse nerves, the same hand that had signed my copy of the will's terms not an hour before. And there was only one person at that table besides Radnor whose signature I'd seen that evening." The implication hung in the quiet library for a long moment, unspoken but entirely clear. It was nearly midnight when Barty found Meg in the greenhouse, where she had gone in search of quiet after the evening's revelations, the humid warmth of the glass house a welcome contrast to the chill that had settled through the rest of the darkened estate. "You should be resting," he said, though there was no reproach in it. "So should you." She studied him for a moment in the low lamplight. "Barty, the old stove, in the corner there. Does anyone still use it?" "Not for years, so far as I know. Old Tam kept it lit in winter, back when the greenhouse needed the extra warmth for the more delicate plants, but the new heating systems made it unnecessary since." He glanced toward it, curious despite himself. "Why do you ask?" "Because Reverend Pemberton mentioned, the day before he died, that Araminta had grown troubled about the estate's finances in her final months. And a woman troubled enough to suspect something is happening beneath her own roof might well hire someone to look into it quietly, rather than raise an alarm she couldn't yet justify." She crossed to the old stove and opened its small iron door, and there, among a scattering of ash and half-burned paper long undisturbed, lay a curled, blackened fragment, the corner of a business card, most of it destroyed, but a few words still legible where the fire had not quite finished its work. "Date investigations," Meg read slowly, tilting it toward the light. "Discreet inquiries, all matters, and here, look, part of a name. F. Aldous." Barty took the fragment carefully, turning it over in his calloused hands, his expression suddenly very still. "Araminta hired someone to look into something," he said slowly. "And burned the evidence of it, or tried to, in a stove nobody's used properly in years." "Or someone else burned it," Meg said quietly, "after she died, hoping no one would think to check the ashes of an old greenhouse stove for anything that mattered." They stood together in silence for a long moment, the fragment held carefully between them, the greenhouse's humid warmth doing nothing to dispel the sudden chill that had settled over both of them. It was Barty who moved first, crouching beside the stove to examine the brickwork more closely, his fingers running along a loose section near the base with the particular attentiveness of a man who had spent years learning every inch of this small glass room. "This brick's never sat right," he murmured, half to himself. "Old Tam used to grumble about it, said the mortar had crumbled years back and no one had ever properly repaired it." He worked his fingers carefully into the gap, and the brick shifted, loose, revealing a small dark cavity behind it that had clearly gone unnoticed by anyone in a very long time. "Barty." He reached into the cavity and withdrew a small, folded photograph, yellowed with age, its edges soft from handling long before it had been hidden away. He unfolded it slowly, and Meg watched his face change entirely as he studied it. The careful, guarded composure he wore like armor dissolving, in a single moment, into something raw and disbelieving. "What is it?" Meg asked gently. He held the photograph out to her without a word, his hand trembling very slightly, and Meg took it, tilting it toward the lamplight to see two young women standing together in this very greenhouse, decades younger than either of the women Meg had come to know at Blackthorn House. One unmistakably a young Araminta Blackthorn, sharp-eyed and smiling in a way Meg had never seen in any formal photograph of her. The other a woman Meg did not recognize at all, but whom Bartai, staring at the image with an expression of complete and total shock, clearly did. "That's my mother," he said, very quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's Dorothy Quince." Standing beside Araminta Blackthorn, in this exact greenhouse, looking for all the world like they'd known each other their whole lives. He looked up at Meg, and in his eyes was a question he could not yet fully form, though Meg understood, watching him, that some part of him had already begun to suspect the shape of an answer he was not at all certain he was ready to hear. Chapter 7: What the Investigator Found. They found the investigators' full report the following morning, tucked inside the false bottom of an old seed tray in the greenhouse's storage shelf, a hiding place so unassuming that Bartai admitted he had walked past it perhaps 1,000 times without ever once suspecting it held anything beyond soil and old clay pots. It was Detective Ashcombe who read it first, in the library, with Meg, Cashin, and Bartai gathered around the desk in a silence so complete that the crackle of the fire seemed almost violently loud. F. Aldous, Ashcombe read aloud from the letterhead. Private Investigations, Discreet Inquiries, London Office. Commissioned by a Mrs. A. Blackthorn, some 4 months before her death, to trace the whereabouts and circumstances of one Dorothy Quince, formerly in service at Blackthorn House. She turned the page, her expression carefully neutral, though Meg noticed her eyes moving quickly, absorbing far more than her measured pace suggested. The report confirms Dorothy Quince left service at Blackthorn House in the autumn of 2003, some months after the death of Peveril Blackthorn Vane, Araminta's only son. She settled in the nearby village of Hartwell, where she gave birth the following spring to a son. The room had gone entirely still. Bartai stood very rigid near the window, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles had gone white. The investigator, Ashcombe continued, her voice gentle now, cross-referenced parish birth records, employment records, and, this is the crucial detail, a letter written by Dorothy Quince herself, some years before her own death, and left with a solicitor in Hartwell to be opened only in the event of her son's majority, or upon specific request. Araminta's investigator obtained a copy through means the report does not specify, though I suspect they were not entirely legal ones. She looked up, meeting Barty's eyes directly. The letter states, in Dorothy Quince's own words, that her son's father was Peveril Blackthorn Vane, conceived in the final months of his life, and that she chose never to reveal this to the Blackthorn family for fear that Araminta, in her grief, might attempt to take the child from her entirely. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke at all. Bartai, Meg said finally, softly. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on some point beyond the window, on the gray, rain-softened grounds he had tended for 6 years without ever once suspecting they were, by right of blood, entirely his own. Say it plainly, he said, his voice very low. I'd rather hear it said plainly than dressed up in solicitor's language. Ashcombe's voice remained gentle, but did not waver. The investigator's report concludes, based on the available evidence, that you are the biological grandson of Araminta Blackthorn, and the legitimate blood heir to Blackthorn House. Bedtime made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and sat down very suddenly in the nearest chair, as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him upright. It was Winifred who found them some 20 minutes later, drawn by the strange, heavy silence that had settled over the house, and it took only a single look at Barty's stricken face for something in her own careful composure to finally, completely crack. "You know," Meg said quietly, watching her. "You've known this whole time." Winifred did not deny it. For a long moment she simply stood in the doorway, her usual dry wit entirely absent, looking suddenly every one of her 67 years. "I gave Dorothy my word," she said finally, her voice thin. 20 years ago, before she died, she made me promise never to speak of it unless she chose to reveal it herself, or unless the boy came to it some other way, through no fault of mine. I have kept that promise faithfully, at no small cost to my own conscience, and I will not apologize for honoring a dying woman's wishes, whatever any of you may think of me for it." "You could have told Araminta," Cashin said. "Before she died. You could have spared her 4 months of hiring an investigator to trace what you already knew." "I could have," Winifred agreed, and something in her voice cracked, finally, into genuine grief. "I have asked myself every day since Dorothy's death whether I made the right choice in staying silent. I still don't know the answer. I only know that Dorothy was terrified, genuinely terrified. That Araminta, in the depths of her grief over Peveril, might have tried to claim the child as her own, leaving Dorothy with nothing, not even the son she'd carried and raised alone. Whatever you think of my silence, it was not born of cruelty. It was born of trying, in my own imperfect way, to honor the last wish of a woman I had come to love as a friend, even if I could never quite call her family." She crossed the room slowly and knelt beside Barty's chair, taking his hand in both of hers with a gentleness that surprised Meg, given the older woman's usual brisk detachment. "I am sorry," Winifred said quietly. "Truly sorry, for whatever my silence has cost you. But I want you to know, your mother loved you more fiercely than I have ever seen a woman love anyone. Whatever she kept from you, she kept because she was trying, in the only way she knew how, to protect you from a house and a family that had already broken her heart once." Barty's composure finally gave way entirely, and he wept, quietly and without shame, while Winifred held his hand and Meg stood watching, her own eyes burning, understanding for the first time the full weight of everything this quiet, watchful young man had carried without ever once knowing why. It was Hollis Radnor, arriving that afternoon to be briefed on the investigator's findings, who brought the second piece of the puzzle forward, his expression grave as he laid out a stack of papers he had spent the morning reviewing with mounting unease. "I've gone through every document bearing my signature in the estate's records for the past decade," he said, addressing Ashcombe directly. "I found 17 instances I do not recognize as my own hand, all authorizing payments similar to the ones we discussed several days ago, invoices for repairs and services that, upon closer inspection, appear never to have been rendered at all." 17, Ashcombe repeated slowly. "Over a period of roughly 8 years, yes." Radnor's face was pale. "I have spent 30 years building a reputation for meticulous, trustworthy record-keeping, Inspector," And I confess I find it deeply disturbing to discover that someone has been forging my signature under my own nose for the better part of a decade, without my once suspecting it. Who had access to documents requiring your signature, closely enough to study your hand and reproduce it convincingly? Radnor hesitated, and something in his careful, lawyerly reluctance told Meg, before he even spoke, exactly whose name he was about to say. Miss Rourke corresponded with my office regularly, on Araminta's behalf, regarding routine estate matters. She would have had ample opportunity to study my signature across a great many genuine documents before ever attempting to reproduce it. That is not proof of anything, said a voice from the doorway, calm and measured, and they all turned to find Adeline standing there, her expression composed but her eyes sharp with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. Familiarity with a signature is not the same as forging one, Mr. Radnor, and I would ask that you be rather more careful about the implications you allow to hang in a room like this. No one has named you directly, Ashcombe said mildly. No one has needed to, Adeline said again, echoing her own words from days before, though this time her voice carried a harder edge. I understand suspicion falls naturally on whoever managed the money, Inspector. I have understood that since the day you first arrived. But I would remind everyone in this room that suspicion is not evidence, and that I have given this family 12 years of loyal, careful service, and I do not intend to have that service erased by whispers and forged signatures I had no part in creating. She turned then, and her gaze fell upon Bartai, still seated near the window, his face still marked by the tears he had not fully composed himself from. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite alarm, Meg thought, watching closely, but something adjacent to it, a rapid and careful recalculation happening behind otherwise composed features. I understand congratulations may be in order, Adeline said, her voice carefully even. The rightful heir of Blackthorn House, restored to his inheritance at last. How very fitting, given everything this house has already survived. It isn't a matter for congratulation, Bartai said quietly, his voice still rough from weeping. I didn't ask for any of this. I only wanted to keep the gardens alive. No, Adeline agreed softly. I don't imagine you did. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving once more across the gathered faces, the stack of forged documents, the investigator's report still open on the desk. If you'll all excuse me, she said finally, her voice perfectly, carefully even, I find I have some matters to see to in the study. Estate business does not pause, whatever else this house has decided to reveal today. She left the room with measured, unhurried steps, and it was only after the door had closed behind her that Meg realized her hands, at her sides, had been clenched into fists the entire time, her knuckles pale, her composure. Meg understood now, watching the empty doorway, a carefully maintained performance stretched, for the very first time since Meg had met her, nearly to its breaking point. Should someone follow her? Meg asked quietly. Ashcombe was already moving toward the door, her earlier unhurried patience replaced by something considerably more urgent. I think, she said, that someone very much should. Chapter 8, The Fuller Bottle. Ashcombe found Adeline in the estate study, standing quite calmly at the tall window overlooking the rain-soaked lawns, a single ledger open on the desk before her. She did not turn immediately when the door opened, and when she finally did, her composure had returned so completely that Meg, following a step behind the inspector, found herself briefly doubting everything she had witnessed in the library only minutes before. I was reviewing the quarterly accounts, Adeline said, gesturing at the open ledger with perfect, unhurried calm. I find it steadies me, in difficult moments, to return to something orderly. You may examine anything on this desk you wish, Inspector. I have nothing to hide from you. Ashcombe studied her for a long moment, and Meg understood, watching the two women regard one another across the quiet study, that neither of them believed the other entirely, and that both of them knew it. I'll want a formal statement from you tomorrow, Ashcombe said finally. Regarding your management of the accounts, and anything you might recall about who else had access to documents bearing Mr. Radnor's signature. Of course, Inspector. Whatever helps you find the truth of this matter. Adeline's voice was steady, cooperative, entirely without visible strain. I want this resolved as much as anyone in this house. More, perhaps, given how thoroughly my own reputation has already been dragged through it. She returned to her ledger, and Ashcombe, after a long moment, withdrew, gesturing for Meg to follow. It was only once they were well clear of the study that the inspector spoke again, her voice low. She's frightened, Ashcombe said quietly. Whatever else that composure is hiding, Miss Farrow, I've interviewed a great many frightened people in my career, and I know the particular stillness it produces when someone is working very hard to control it. She was not reviewing accounts when we entered that room. She was thinking, very carefully, about what she needed to do next. Cashin's formal statement to Ashcombe, delivered the following morning in the library with Radnor present to advise on the legal weight of what was being said, laid out with methodical, clinical precision everything he had been building towards since the first days of the investigation. Digitalis, in therapeutic doses, is a common and effective treatment for the sort of cardiac condition Araminta Blackthorn was known to suffer from, he began, his physician's manner replacing his earlier urgency with something more measured, more devastating for its calm. In excessive doses, however, or through improper dosing over an extended period, it produces symptoms that closely mimic natural cardiac decline. Irregular heartbeat, eventual heart failure, death that would appear, to any physician not looking specifically for signs of toxicity, to be an unremarkable culmination of an existing condition. You believe this is what happened to Araminta, Ashcombe said. I believe it is the only explanation that accounts for every detail we've gathered. A medication bottle that should have been nearly empty, found nearly full. A woman who, by her housekeeper's own account, seemed sharper and more purposeful in her final weeks than she had in years, hardly the profile of someone whose heart was quietly failing on its own timeline. And an expression on her face at death that her own housekeeper described as one of faint surprise, rather than the peaceful release one generally sees in a long-anticipated natural passing. Cashin's voice had gained a quiet intensity that filled the room. I believe someone was tampering with her dosage, likely by diluting or substituting her prescribed medication, over a period of weeks, in a manner precisely calculated to produce a death that would raise no immediate suspicion whatsoever. And no autopsy was ever performed, Ashcombe said. Which is, forgive me, an oversight I find nearly as troubling as the murder itself, Cashin said. An elderly woman with a known heart condition dies in her sleep, and everyone, her physician included, accepts the obvious explanation without a second thought, because it is the explanation that requires the least difficult questioning of anyone close to her. It is precisely the sort of death that a careful, patient killer would choose to engineer, Inspector, because it asks nothing of anyone but grief. Radnor, listening with visible discomfort, finally spoke. If this is true, if Araminta was murdered in this manner, then whoever did it would have needed regular, unsupervised access to her private medication, over an extended period of time, without arousing her suspicion. Which narrows the possibilities considerably, Ashcombe said quietly, to someone who was in this house often enough, and trusted enough, to be alone with her personal effects on a regular basis, without anyone thinking twice about it. No one in the room said the name aloud. No one, by this point, needed to. It was Mrs. Pruitt who provided the final, formal confirmation of the detail Cashin had already relayed privately days before, giving her account to Ashcombe with the careful precision of a woman who had turned every detail over in her mind 100 times since her mistress's death. I remarked on it to Dr. Odell before any of this began, she said, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The bottle in her drawer, the week she died. I'd seen her take her tablets every morning without fail, same as she had for years, and yet when I came to clear her things after, forgive me, it's not a task I enjoy remembering, the bottle was fuller than it ought to have been, given how long she'd had it. I thought at the time perhaps her prescription had simply been refilled recently and I'd misjudged the timing. I didn't think more of it until Dr. Odell asked me the same question, and I realized how strange it truly was. Who had access to that drawer, Mrs. Pruitt? Ashcombe asked. Myself, when I cleaned the room. Araminta herself, of course. And Miss Rourke, on the occasion she brought papers up for Araminta to review privately, rather than in the study, which happened more often, these last months, than it had in years past. Mrs. Pruitt's voice was quiet, careful, clearly reluctant to say what she was saying, even now. I don't like to think ill of Miss Rourke, Inspector. She's always been perfectly civil to me, in 12 years. But I'll not lie to protect anyone, not with 2 people already dead in this house. It was Radnor himself, briefly, who came under a shadow of suspicion that afternoon, when Ashcombe, reviewing the forged documents once more, noted that several bore not merely an imitation of his signature but what appeared to be an impression from an old rubber stamp he had once used for routine correspondence, decades before. I haven't used that stamp in 15 years, Radnor said, genuinely startled when shown the evidence. It should be locked in my office safe in Hartwell, along with a great many other retired items of correspondence. Should be, Ashcombe repeated. Radnor's face paled as understanding dawned. Miss Rourke visited my office on several occasions, over the years, to collect or deliver papers on Araminta's behalf. She would have had opportunity, however brief, to access items in my outer office, if not the safe itself, assuming she knew where such things were kept, or happened upon them by chance. You're certain you didn't simply misplace the stamp yourself, at some point? Ashcombe asked, not unkindly, though the question needed asking. I keep meticulous records, Inspector, Radnor said, with the same wounded precision he had shown once before. I would know if I had used it. I would know if I had lost it. I am telling you, as plainly as I know how, that someone removed that stamp from my possession without my knowledge, used it to lend false authenticity to fraudulent documents, and returned it, presumably, before I ever thought to look for it. His expression had gone grim. There is only one person who had regular access to my office, my correspondence, and this estate's private financial affairs across the entire period these forgeries span, Inspector. I do not enjoy saying her name in this context. But I no longer believe I can responsibly avoid it. It was Meg, that evening, who made the discovery that would tighten the case beyond any further reasonable doubt, though it came, as so much of the truth in that house had come, entirely by accident. She had gone to the estate office in search of a spare ledger, at Radnor's request, and found the desk autoline generally used for her paperwork left slightly ajar, its usual meticulous order disturbed in a way that suggested someone had left in some haste. She should not, she knew, have opened the drawer further. She told herself, afterward, that she had only meant to close it properly, out of habit, and had glimpsed the paper's edge purely by accident. It was a single sheet, hand-drawn, depicting what was unmistakably a genealogy chart, names connected by careful pencil lines, dates noted beside several of them. At its center, in Adeline's own careful hand, was a name Meg did not recognize, Beatrice Hale, born 1938, died 1979. Beside it, a smaller notation, dismissed from service, Blackthorn House, 1961, on the authority of R. Vane. Below Beatrice Hale's name, connected by a single pencil line, was another, Adeline Rourke, born 1981. Meg stared at the page for a long moment, her heart beating very fast, before she carefully, quietly, closed the drawer and went to find Detective Ashcombe. Chapter 9, The Name She Buried. Ashcombe examined the genealogy chart for a long time before she spoke, the library quiet around them, rain falling steady and unhurried against the tall windows, as though the house itself had settled in to listen. Beatrice Hale, she said finally. Dismissed from service here in 1961, on the authority of Rutherford Vane. She looked up at Meg. You're certain this was in Miss Rourke's own desk? Her own hand, Meg said. I'd know it now anywhere, after everything Mr. Radnor showed us. It was Radnor, summoned along with the others, who provided the missing piece, his memory jarred loose by the name in a way that made his face go pale as old parchment. Beatrice Hale, he murmured. Good Lord. I hadn't thought of that name in decades. My father handled some of the estate's affairs before I took over the practice, and I recall, as a young man just starting out, a matter concerning a lady's maid dismissed for theft, some missing silver, I believe, though nothing was ever formally proven in any court. Rutherford Vane was quite insistent she be let go without reference, which in those days was tantamount to ruining a woman's prospects entirely. Was she guilty? Meg asked. I couldn't say, with any certainty, all these years later. I remember my father expressing some private doubt about the matter at the time. The silver in question turned up eventually, I believe, in a location that made theft rather unlikely. But by then the woman had already left the district in disgrace, and no one troubled themselves to formally correct the record. His expression had gone grave. If Miss Rourke is this woman's daughter, then she has spent a great many years, Ashcombe finished quietly, working her way into a position of trust in the very house that destroyed her mother's reputation and, I'd imagine, a very great deal more besides. They found Adeline in the drawing room, seated near the dying fire, a single glass of sherry untouched on the table beside her. She looked up as they entered, and something in her face, the composure Meg had watched her maintain through every prior confrontation, had finally, quietly, begun to dissolve. You found her, then, Adeline said, before anyone spoke a word. Beatrice. Your mother, Ashcombe said. My mother. Adeline's voice was very steady, very controlled, though her hands, folded in her lap, were trembling faintly. She never spoke of it, you understand, not in any detail. I grew up knowing only that we had once had money, and standing, and that something had happened, before I was born, that had taken both away entirely. She worked 3 jobs to raise me, Inspector, after Blackthorn House cast her out with no reference and no explanation beyond a single word, thief, attached to her name for the rest of her short life. She died when I was 17, worn out long before her time, and it was only afterward, going through her things, that I found the letters. Her own account of what happened here. Of silver that turned up, eventually, exactly where a careless footman had left it months before, long after she'd already been ruined for a crime that was never truly hers. And you decided, Cashin said quietly, to come here yourself. To work your way into this family's trust. I decided, Adeline said, that if this house had taken everything from my mother on nothing more than a wealthy man's word, then I would take back, quietly and carefully, whatever I judged fair, and no one would ever be able to prove I had done anything more than manage an old woman's accounts competently for 12 years. Her voice had gained a hard, bitter edge. It was never meant to be violence, Inspector. I want that understood, whatever else you believe of me. I meant only to take, slowly, patiently, an amount I judged some rough equivalent to what my mother had been denied, a kind of quiet justice, if you'll allow me the word, that no court would ever have granted her in life. And Araminta, Ashcombe said. When she began to suspect. Adeline was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the dying fire, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone very quiet, very tired. She was sharper than I gave her credit for, in the end. I'd grown careless, I think, after so many years of trust, or perhaps I simply believed she was too old, too grieving, too consumed by her son's memory to notice numbers that didn't quite add themselves correctly. But she began asking questions, gently at first, and then less gently, and I understood, watching her face across that desk one afternoon, that she had already begun to piece together enough of the truth to end everything I had built. So you killed her, Meg said, and though she had known it for some time, saying it aloud in that quiet room felt like a physical blow. I adjusted her medication, Adeline said, and there was, for the first time, something raw and unguarded in her voice. Slowly. Carefully. In amounts small enough that no physician would ever think to question a gradual decline in a woman her age, with her history. I told myself, every single day I did it, that I was not truly killing her. Only hurrying along an ending that would have come regardless, within a year or 2, given her condition. I have told myself that lie so many times, Inspector, that some part of me still almost believes it, though I know, standing here now, that it was never true at all. And Reverend Pemberton, Ashcombe said quietly. Adeline closed her eyes. He came to me, 2 days before he died, and told me, gently, kindly, in that way of his, that he believed something troubling had happened in this house's finances, and that Araminta had confided her suspicions to him before her death. He did not accuse me. He never once said my name. But I understood, watching his careful, sorrowful face, that he had very nearly assembled the truth on his own, and that whatever he intended to do with that knowledge would end everything I had spent a lifetime building. Her voice cracked, finally, into something close to genuine grief. I never meant to become a woman who murders kind old vicars in their own chapel, Inspector. I want you to understand that, whatever good it does me now. I only meant to take back what I believed was owed. Somewhere along the way, protecting that theft became a great deal more important to me than any principle it began with. It was Bartai who spoke next, his voice quiet but steady, the composure Meg had watched him struggle to maintain since the investigator's report now settled into something harder, more resolved. My mother worked in this house, he said. As a maid, same as your mother once did. She loved a man who died before he could marry her, and she kept a secret her whole short life rather than risk this family taking her child from her. You lost a mother to this house's cruelty, Miss Rourke. I lost the chance to ever know my own father, and nearly lost the chance to know my own name, on account of the same house's careless disregard for people who worked its grounds rather than owned them. His eyes were bright, though his voice remained level. I don't excuse what you've done. I don't think anything excuses two deaths, whatever wrong was done to you decades before either of us were born. But I understand, better than most people in this room could, what it is to carry a grievance this house handed down to you before you ever had a chance to choose otherwise. Adeline looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her tired features. Perhaps, she said quietly, if I had known your mother's story sooner, I might have recognized, in her choice to protect you quietly rather than seek revenge, a better way through my own grief than the one I chose instead. It was, Meg thought, the closest thing to genuine remorse Adeline had shown since the conversation began, and it was in that same moment, while every eye in the room remained fixed upon her, that Adeline moved. She was on her feet and through the drawing-room door before Ashcombe could fully react, moving with a speed that belied her earlier exhaustion, and by the time the rest of them reached the corridor, she had already disappeared toward the library, toward the very desk where Radnor had spent days assembling the evidence that would end her. They found her there moments later, a small fire already catching in the grate, the last of the estate's forged ledgers and, Meg saw with a cold lurch of horror, the folder containing Barty's investigator's report and his mother's original letter, all fed hastily into flames that had not yet fully taken hold. Miss Rourke. Ashcombe's voice cracked like a whip across the room. Step away from the fire, now. Adeline turned, her face lit from below by the growing flames, and for just a moment, standing there with the last evidence of her crimes and Barty's entire inheritance curling to ash before her, she looked less like a calculating criminal than a woman entirely undone by grief she had carried alone for far too long. It has to burn, she said, her voice strangely calm. All of it. If there's nothing left to prove what happened, perhaps none of it need matter anymore. Barty's mother's letter is in there, Meg said, horror rising in her voice. The only proof he has of who he truly is. Something in Adeline's expression flickered, uncertain, as the flames caught more fully, licking now at the edges of papers that held, within them, the entire truth of two families' long-buried griefs. Chapter 10, What the House Keeps. For one terrible moment, Meg believed they would lose it all, the letter, the report, the last fragile proof of everything Dorothy Quince had sacrificed to protect her son. Then Cashin moved, fast and sure in a way that spoke of a man who had spent years reacting quickly in far worse emergencies than a library fire, snatching the heavy woolen throw from the nearest chair and smothering the flames with 3 swift, practiced strikes. Smoke filled the room, acrid and choking, and for several long moments there was only coughing and confusion and the frantic stamping out of stray embers threatening to catch on the old carpet. When it finally cleared, Meg found herself kneeling beside the scorched remains of the fire, her hands trembling as she sorted through singed papers with desperate care. "Here," she said, her voice cracking with relief. "Bartai, here. It's damaged, but it's readable. Look." The edges of Dorothy Quince's letter had curled and blackened, but the center of the page, where her careful, looping hand had written the truth of her son's parentage 20 years before, remained whole and legible. Bartai took it with hands that shook rather more than his usual composure allowed, and read his mother's words in silence, his eyes bright with tears he no longer troubled himself to hide. Behind them, Ashcombe had already taken hold of Adeline's arm, her earlier gentleness replaced now with the brisk, practiced efficiency of an officer making an arrest she had clearly seen coming for some time. "Adeline Rourke," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the smoke-filled room, "I am arresting you for the murders of Araminta Blackthorn and Reverend Silas Pemberton, and for fraud against the Blackthorn estate spanning a period of no less than 8 years. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Adeline did not resist. She stood very still as Ashcombe spoke the formal words, her earlier desperate energy entirely spent, and when she finally looked up, her eyes found Barty's across the smoke-hazed room. "I am sorry," she said quietly, and for the first time since Meg had met her, the words carried the unmistakable weight of genuine feeling rather than careful performance. "For your mother's sacrifice, and for mine. I think, in the end, we were not so very different, she and I, 2 women who loved someone this house could never quite make room for, and who each, in our own way, tried to protect what little we had left. The difference," Bartai said quietly, his mother's letter still held carefully in his hands, "is that she protected me by giving up everything she might have claimed. You tried to take back what you'd lost by taking from people who'd already lost enough themselves." He looked at her steadily, grief and something almost like compassion mingled in his young face. "I hope, wherever you go from here, you find some way to grieve your mother that doesn't require anyone else to die for it." Ashcombe led her from the room without another word, and the house, in the silence that followed, seemed to exhale at last, as though it too had been holding its breath through every terrible revelation of the past 10 days. The days that followed passed in a strange, quiet blur of official business, statements given, evidence catalogued, the full scope of Adeline's embezzlement finally laid bare across nearly a decade of careful, patient theft. Hollis Radnor, working alongside Ashcombe's officers, produced a complete account of the funds diverted from the estate, a sum that, while substantial, proved recoverable given the careful paper trail Adeline had, in her own meticulous way, unknowingly left behind. She was clever, Radnor admitted to Meg, some days later, as they sat together in the library going through the last of the recovered ledgers. Clever enough to hide it for years. But not quite clever enough, in the end, to account for an old woman's sharpening suspicion in her final months, or a young man's stubborn habit of tending a greenhouse stove nobody else thought twice about. Do you think Araminta ever suspected who Adeline truly was? Beatrice Hale's daughter? Radnor considered this for a long moment. I don't believe so, no. I think Araminta suspected only that something in the accounts was wrong, without ever imagining the full, tangled history behind it. Perhaps that's its own small tragedy, buried inside the larger one, 2 women, each carrying grief this house had caused them, generations apart, and neither of them ever quite realizing how their stories had come to be so closely entwined. It was nearly a week later, on a rare clear evening when the rain had finally, gratefully, given way to a soft, gold autumn light across the grounds, that Barty called the remaining 5 of them together in the drawing room. Meg, Cashin, Winifred, Perry, now fully recovered and considerably chastened, and Mrs. Pruitt, invited for the first time to sit rather than serve. "I've spoken with Mr. Radnor," Barty began, a little awkwardly, clearly unused to addressing a room rather than working quietly within it. "About the terms of the will, now that everything's been sorted through properly. As the confirmed heir, it seems the house and the estate passed to me directly, rather than being divided as originally intended." "As is only right," Winifred said gently. "Maybe. I don't know that I feel much like a man who's inherited a fortune, if I'm honest. Mostly I feel like a man who's inherited an awful lot of grief that isn't fully mine to carry, and a house full of people who came here as strangers and ended up seeing me through the worst days of my life." He paused, gathering himself. "I don't want to simply take what's mine and send the rest of you on your way, back to lives that this house has already turned upside down once. I'd like to ask you all to stay. Not for a year, out of obligation to some condition in a will. Just because I think this house has spent long enough collecting people who wanted something from it, same as Araminta said. I'd rather it started collecting people who simply wanted to be here." Meg felt her throat tighten. "Barty. I mean it. Miss Sorrel, you knew this house longer than anyone left living, and kept a promise that cost you dearly to keep. I'd like you to stay, if you'd have it, and finally get to be more than a guest here. Dr. Odell, you've a mind for uncovering truths other people would rather leave buried, and I think this house could use someone willing to keep asking uncomfortable questions when it matters." Perry, he allowed himself a small, wry smile, "You owe considerably less money than you did a fortnight ago, given everything Ashcombe's people managed to untangle with that moneylender of yours, and I think a man given a second chance ought to be given somewhere decent to spend it. And Meg." He looked at her directly, and something in his quiet, steady gaze made her breath catch. "You loved Araminta enough to come back to a house full of strangers on nothing more than an old woman's memory of your childhood drawings. I think that's exactly the kind of person this house has been waiting for." They stood together in the greenhouse that evening, as the last light faded gently over the grounds. The orchids Barty had tended faithfully through every dark day of the investigation now blooming in full, defiant color against the coming dusk. "She'd have liked this," Meg said quietly, standing beside Barty among the flowers his grandmother had loved so fiercely. "Seeing you here. Knowing, finally, who you were to her." "I like to think so." Barty's hands moved gently among the orchids, checking soil and stems with the same careful attention he had always given them, though now, Meg understood, it carried an entirely different weight, not merely a groundskeeper's duty, but a grandson's quiet inheritance of love passed down through soil and stem rather than words. Old Tam used to say a garden remembers everyone who's ever cared for it properly, long after the people themselves are gone. I didn't understand what he meant, not really, until I found that photograph. Now I think I understand it better than anything else this whole strange fortnight has taught me. Outside, the rain had finally cleared entirely, and through the greenhouse's fogged glass, The first stars of a genuinely clear night were beginning to show themselves above Blackthorn House, its two mismatched wings settling at last into something that looked, for the first time in longer than any of them could say, like peace. "What will you do with it all?" Meg asked. "The house. The fortune. Everything that's suddenly, entirely yours?" Bartai considered this for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the greenhouse, the grounds beyond it, the great grey house rising against the darkening sky. "I think," he said finally, "I'll keep doing exactly what I've always done. Tend the gardens. Keep the fires lit. Make sure the house remembers, properly this time, that it was built to shelter people who care for it, not to be fought over by people who only ever wanted what it could give them." He smiled, small and genuine, the first truly unguarded smile Meg had seen from him since she'd arrived. "And maybe, now and then, I'll let it collect a few more people worth keeping. It seems, from everything Araminta left behind, that's rather what she wanted all along." Somewhere in the house behind them, faint and distant, one of the old convalescent bells rang softly through the walls, the wind, most likely, or the damp working its way once more into ancient, forgotten wiring. But standing there in the fading light, surrounded by orchids that had somehow, faithfully, kept blooming through every dark day the house had endured, Meg found she no longer needed an explanation for every strange and lovely thing this old house chose to remember. Some houses, she thought, simply waited a very long time for the right person to come home to them. And some, like this one, if you were patient enough, and honest enough, and willing enough to stay through the worst of the dark to see the light return, would finally, gratefully, let you. The end.